much further ado, let me introduce our first speaker for tonight. We've got Martin, who's going to be speaking to us about the joy of stateless UI components. So please join me in unmuting and welcoming Martin. Thank you, Martin.
Right. So I'd like to talk to you about experience that I have for the past few months at Primitive. Basically, I want to share and describe the joy that I am living with the stateless UI components, and this might sound very weird, but I hope I will be able to kind of make you see why this is the case. So this is going to be stateless UI components with Elm book first approach and using Tailwind CSS, which I'm not going to talk about much because the technology behind that doesn't matter much. It could be Elm UI, it could be Elm CSS, it could be CSS, just like in separate CSS files. So doesn't matter much, but yeah, I'm going to be talking about stateless and about Elm book. And so I want to tell you, or describe to you the workflow that my team has settled on as we implement a new version of our application, how we changed our environment to kind of change our habits and force ourselves to think about the API on the modules that we create. So let me paint the scene. We have an application written in Elm, and it has mostly grown organically. And what I mean by that is, at least what I get from the retelling of people that have been there longer than me, there was no designer to hold us accountable. And so we didn't really pay much attention to contrast or accessibility and any kind of like consistency. And so over time, it accrued multiple different implementations and designs of drop downs, expression tree builders, and so on. Basically, pages from 2 years ago look different than pages done now, and so on. And so that might have been one of the reasons that the company started, saying let's hire some designers, let's create a design, let's kind of push this application into the year 2022. And so right around the time when I come to the company, there is an effort underway with a design agency to redesign pages, to improve and streamline the user flows, to set a consistent style and tone, to be more accessible, and so on. And first came the wireframes that you can see, then full-fledged designs. And so our dashboard team, which is the team I'm part of, had a big task. We had a big task in front of us: how to go about this rewrite. How do we change things in place? Do we do everything from scratch? How do we make sure we keep the design consistent going forward? Can we change anything about our process to make it easier, right? And so there was this kind of planning, this kind of challenge. And while there was a lot of back and forth with figuring this out, and I don't want to bore you with the whole story, I want to give you the end result and what we decided on and what we feel is working for us. And because I think Elm and the ecosystem around it really gives us something special here. And so you have all seen the title slide, you know what's coming, Elm book. And by the way, you can take a look at our Primitive Elm book if you want. It's public at dash.primitive.com/marina. And it's mostly just like for us developers to see and test things out. And it's not really, advertised anywhere. So, be gentle with us. But it's an example of like design system that we have. And anyways, I want to publicly thank Georgios Boris. Sorry for butchering your name. It is making my life so much better. Really, Elm book is like giving me joy, and In fact, it's one of the few things that have managed to up the ante that Elm has set. Like Elm format, Elm review, Lambda, and now Elm book. These are all things that are extracting even more joy than Elm itself does, and laying that on top. Maybe it will be fair to say what it is. Elm book to me is Elm version of the React Storybook, which started it all, I believe. And that is, I quote the React Storybook page, development environment tool that is used as a playground for UI components. And what it means is you write the new component in isolation in the Storybook, and only then you use it outside in the real application, in the real world. And the results are, I think, vastly better. And it results in cleaner API than if you did everything inline, right? If you just wrote the new dropdown straight in the application. Because that's kind of what we do if we are given no constraints, right? We just do everything at once until it works, and that's job done. And with Elm, we kind of get away with it because refactoring is easier than in other languages. So we kind of push the problem into the future, right? Somebody else can possibly extract that function and do something about it later, clean it up later. Well, I can tell you, I've been in the future and it catches up with you. In past company where I worked, we had a similar situation. It was just possibly it was there longer, and the situation was even worse. And it's not fun. It is okay for a very long time, and then it's kind of just we really need to do something about it. So this implementation of both behavior and presentation at the same time is doable, but we can do better if we separate them. And I am a big proponent of constraints. If you love Elm, you will probably agree with me that constraints will be great, right? Constraints like immutability or pureness, they give you something back in return. It's not just all bad, it actually gives you something back. And similarly, in this context, implementing the designs kind of free-form, inline, right, in the application, it might give you maximal freedom, but it doesn't give you the best results. And what the Elm book approach, people call it storybook-driven development, what it suggests you do, and what we now do at Primitive, is if your application needs something new designed, maybe a chart, maybe a drop-down, breadcrumbs, whatever, implement it in isolation, without any behavior, stateless, presentation only. And once that's done, and you see all the needed states represented and looking good, plug that into your application. And this has the effect of making the presentation live in its own file, right? Never interwoven with the behavior code, with the application itself. And secondly, it forces you to think about the API of the UI component before you use it. It forces you to make the component as minimal and nice as possible, and kind of usage agnostic, because you don't know who's going to use it, in which contexts are you going to use it in the future. And this makes it much nicer to use than if you wrote it inline for a specific usage in the application and only then try to extract it into its own view function. And so if you do this, these components read very nicely, very declaratively, and there is very clear distinction between the application view and the components, because it's all extracted ahead of time for you, right? And they are just function calls. When you implement everything together at the same time, you usually end up with something interwoven and braided together, and it can be hard to separate those. But since we have separated the step of writing the component into its own step, separate from the application, and we only started using it after it was implemented, that problem goes away. And now this might sound petty and silly, but with something as nice as Elm book, I mean in the graphic sense, you want to write it for Elmbook first and use it in your application second, right? There's almost no habit to break. Like, I don't tell myself, oh, I would just love to just write it in the application and be done with it. No, I look forward to writing it in Elmbook. At least I get a kick of seeing the various states of the component living next to each other, and I almost have to remember to actually use it in the application afterwards. And I need to say this is nothing new. I definitely felt like stumbling onto something awesome, but there is literally a blog post, Storybook-driven development, and there are at least 4 or 5 other Elm packages, like UI explorers, and they date, 5 years back probably. So I might be preaching to the choir here. Maybe everybody already knows this, and I might be rehashing all ideas, but I am just so happy about what I have found that if there is anybody struggling with their application and drowning in SCSS and having 10 different button styles in their application, I don't know if you saw this. It's awesome. It's style. Somebody on Reddit picked all the Steam menus and buttons, and yeah, so they also have problem with consistency. So if this is you, you need to try this approach of implementing designs and front-end components. So that's the Elmbook part of the talk. Now let me say a few words about the actual API design. And so in the title, I mentioned stateless UI components. So what exactly do I mean by that? The big idea for me is to avoid message and update at all costs. Maybe not at all costs, but almost. And how do you do that is with the config pattern, or as I have heard it called, I believe by Richard Feldman, teach me how to do something pattern, right? So in the ideal case, your UI element doesn't really need any interactivity. And so let's say it's a change pill showing some percentage. Well, there is no on-click handler. There's nothing else. The only thing that changes is the integer in there, right? The percentage. So it's just a view function. And that's all. Same if it's more, visually complex, but no interactivity still, you have, record with some strings in there, but this is still not the full config pattern. It's just like a record with stuff. When you do need interactivity, you just let the user specify the message that should be emitted whenever something happens. You'll register that with the HTML events on-click handler, and 90% of the time, that's all you need to do. No need for any custom message type, no need for your custom update function, no need for like plugging the whole DLM architecture boilerplate. The goal is to keep things presentational, keep the behavior out of that. And this stateless approach scales surprisingly well. Here's an example of a table component. By the way, many thanks to Evan Chaplicki for his Elm sortable table repository that really drove this home for me. Table is quite, complex component. It does have some state, right? But you can delegate it to the user, and that's the beauty of the config pattern. So what I mean by that is, for example, we need to hold the current sorting, right? Which column are we sorting by? Well, we don't want to hold anything. The user will hold it, and they will give it to us. And of course, we give the user a way to create a value of this sorting type so that they can initialize it, and they will have a new message to kind of deal with that. And handling that message is most of the time with these components, it's very brain dead. You just like set the field in the model and you're done. And the same process can be repeated for, pagination and other interactivity as well. So you, as the component, you give the user your state, they will hold it for you, and they will own the messages for your interactivity. And so there's no like HTML mapping, there is no calling of your like update function and dealing with all that. It's very clean, it's very like view only, beautiful. And so basically the config pattern just delegates everything to the parent, right? You deal with it, not me. And so that's my suggestion to you when you are writing, view code. As a default, start with the config pattern. Your views can be just simple function. It doesn't need to be the whole, message update view, subscriptions in it. It doesn't have to be all of that. You will always have the option to fall back to the fully stateful Elm architecture component later if you find something that will be, unnecessarily hard with the stateless solution. And there are some cases where it doesn't scale all of the way. But going from stateless to stateful, if you will need it at all, it will be going that way will be easy. But going the other way from stateful to stateless is probably going to be way harder. So default to the simple, small constraint solution. It will make your functions nicer to use. There will be way less boilerplate. It will be easy to inspect, think about. So to summarize, if you are fighting inconsistency in your design and you have a bunch of slightly different buttons, application that really should be the same, or if you are if your company is starting a huge like redesign project, maybe give Elmbook and the Storybook-driven design a chance. More importantly, implement your elements in isolation and only then use them in the application as if it was a library. Constraints liberate, and this is one weird trick that I have found helps me, and I believe it will help you make your code cleaner and the process of implementing it simpler, because dealing just with one aspect is simpler than doing everything at once. And Elmbook, if I were to ignore all its other benefits, it's just a way for me to reward my brain while doing it. It's just kind of like pleasure to work with. And so why not surround yourself with nice things? Yeah, but it's a very clear like option to, if I want to try the storybook-driven development, this is a very good tool to use it, to do that with. Well, and secondly, as you implement these UI components, strive for as little power as possible. Aim for stateless functions. View function that isn't even a function is the holy grail, right? If it's just like something that is HTML message done, that's awesome. View function that just takes data and doesn't deal with messages, that's great. That's what you want most of the time. View function that delegates the bookkeeping to the user, that's still really good. And a full-blown stateful module that has its own message type, update function, that's not so nice. So try to stay on the light side. And again, I think the slogan sums it up really well. As little power as possible. Rule of the least power. So yeah, that's my experience, and that's my little bit of wisdom. So go forth and write stateless view function in Elmbook.
Awesome. Thank you, Martin. Please join me in thanking Martin. Thank you. Okay. Any questions then?
I have a question
from anybody. Go for it.
So I've used React Storybook, and I ultimately abandoned it because of like the wiring it took for the Storybook aspect itself. I felt like I was making an entire second application. So can you compare this experience to that?
Yeah, so at previous job we had a little, or I had a bit of experience with React Storybook, and we tried, to plug in like Elm components wrapped in web components, and yeah, it's just different, and yeah, I think we never really solved all the like configuration of. I think it's derived from TypeScript types and so on, and we never really figured out how to make it show all these like, okay, this button can be primary or secondary, and all these like configuration. So it was yeah, we had a hard time with that as well. Yeah, and so I think Elmbook it's really nice in that setting it up for like non-interactive things is really easy. Setting it up for stateful things is, you have to figure out, okay, so this is the type it needs to have, and this is how I set it up, but it's still very simple. But it doesn't do any magic for you, right? So it doesn't generate all these like config things itself. You need to basically create your own like view function and ways to update your model and so on. So there is like a little Elm application in there in like the stateful chapters, but it's much more, I think, understandable than trying to figure out, okay, how do I like, what incantation do I need to like spell for this to show up, right? Everything is in your hand. It's not, I feel like it's not a framework, it's a library. And so it's really like gives you all the power and doesn't do anything magic.
Cool.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, we've got Matt. Would you like to ask a
Rob,
question?
was there the Redux store involved when you had the trouble with React Storybook?
Sorry, what was that?
Was a Redux store involved in it when you had that trouble?
Yeah, and I also had some TypeScript performance compiler. It's like just it was a very slow, sluggish experience because of the type checking.
I mean, I had very similar trouble with React Storybook because it was hell trying to wire the Redux store correctly for the component to work. But the question I have is, Martin, how do you handle something like the name of your I will.
Sorry, you muted yourself.
I was just looking at the name of the component, and yeah, the workspace dropdown, like something like a dropdown that has a little bit of state.
Yeah.
How do you make sure it updates itself with the correct state?
Yeah. So what you found there in our Marina, yeah, workspace dropdown is one of those things that don't really. So it has its behavior. It has like state. It is, I think, the most complex thing of all the other components, and so maybe now with like hindsight, maybe I would like to restructure it. But it basically, this one is very close to the application. It will only ever be used in one place, and so it is written with a specific API endpoint in mind, right? So workspace dropdown example is not really like it's not as presentational as I would like it to be. It does have like, okay, so we are gonna get this like tree of workspaces, and there are these like business rules on, okay, I guess, there is a list of organizations. Each organization has a tree of workspaces. The root workspace, we are just going to like flatten that and so on. So there's a lot of things that aren't just, it isn't presentational. Yeah.
Okay, so it's one of the exceptions you mentioned.
Yeah. It's again, maybe we would have done better if, again, we would push this logic out of it and we would just make it just a view function that takes data and just renders HTML and doesn't do much else, doesn't do the filtering of the trees and stuff like that. So yeah, lessons learned, and so maybe something for us in the future to re-implement.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Martin has a question for Martin.
I do. So if I understand correctly, Elm Book is one of the packages that you're using for representing the UI. You showed a bunch of other packages, so I'm wondering, how did you decide which one to use?
So I had previous experience with Elm Book from Germany. I believe Permutive have been using, it was one of those like UI Explorer, like one of those two packages that are named UI Explorer. I don't know who's the author of, and which one is the fork, but yeah, I don't know. We I guess I was like showed it off, and right, yeah. So basically, I had prior experience with Elm Book, and I just like showed off a demo, and it kind of took off. Yeah, so maybe the other practices are better. I don't know, but yeah, you know, my colleagues have had prior experience with one of them, and Elm Book probably seemed better to them in comparison. I don't know. They're actually here, so Jonathan and Mate, maybe you can comment on that. But
I think Elm Book just looked really nice. And the way the packages or the documentation was organized was really accessible as well, and really nice to go through. Perhaps it has, it's a bit more complicated to wire up some of the more complex kind of usages. But we kind of gave it a test first for a while, and then everyone liked it, so we kept it.
Cool. All right, thank you.
Okay, question from Francisco.
So yeah, I have some questions. Hello, Martin. Thanks for the talk. So the first one has to do with when dealing with stateless or stateful, I always first try the stateless approach, but some cases such as drop downs, or they just it just feels like you have to make, let's say, the client or the user, you give him all the burden of dealing with that state. So do you sort of agree that for some cases, yeah, it's preferable maybe to go stateful, and for others, because I feel like I'm switching between one or the other. The typical case is the drop down, for example, in which I prefer a stateful. I don't know what your thoughts are.
right, yeah. So for me, I guess for me the border between stateful and stateless like lies somewhere else on the spectrum. So for me, drop downs are still like perfectly fine if they are like stateless, or at least like done with the config pattern. So yeah, definitely there still is state, right? Do you need to know, is it open, is it not? Maybe which item you are on, right? But we try to minimize the state. By that I mean, if we can leverage the browser, for example, like the focus, right? So we don't hold the focus in the model, right? We don't know which item is focused right now, but each item has its own like on-click handler or on-enter handler, and so basically you will know which one it is. So there are some things that like in the first iteration we would hold that state, but we found a way not to hold the state. And second, it's just like for us, I feel it's better to delegate holding that boolean to the application, to the usage, and keeping the drop-down view just a function, right? Again, like it achieves the same result. The state just lives somewhere else, and there's less boilerplate. So I think that's a win. I can perhaps talk about like when, in our experience, it wasn't enough, and that has to deal. It has to deal with like accessibility and keyboard navigation. So that's where we find things start getting tricky. And in one of the cases, I think it's the workspace dropdown, we really just had to, add some new like handlers. For example, give me a message that will focus some element, right? So that I can, like, if I press the key down, it will focus the other thing. So, yeah, if you start adding accessibility to and like keyboard navigation to your components, it will complicate stuff. I think it's still worth it, right? Accessibility is good, but yeah, it's gonna like that might be the thing that will push you to, okay, let's just do this in a stateful way. And one big roadblock that I have found where I have figured it's either going to be very hacky or I will just need to switch to stateful, to like the full decomponent, is when you would basically like to emit two messages at once, right? So please focus this, and please, I don't know, like set the input to some string. And you can't really do that. You would have to, like wrap two divs, wrap one div in another div, or like have some JavaScript solution to that, or something even more hacky. So sometimes it is just better for the component to say, okay, I'm going to have my message. I will emit that one message, right? Emitting one message is fine. Emitting two messages is horrible. So I will emit that one message, and I will have the update function that knows how to deal with it, right? And in that update function, I can now do multiple things at once. So I can focus that thing, I can change the model. Now it isn't a problem. So yeah, so sometimes there are just things that can't be done with the config pattern and with stateless. But I have found that for me, the border is way, somewhere else than I thought. I would think that like half of the components will have to be stateful, and I have realized that like majority of the components can be stateless. So that's for me the big realization. Like if the table can be stateless, like what can't almost. So yeah, maybe just like give the stateless a try, and it might just like surprise you that, okay, that's actually possible.
Okay, thanks. I got two more questions, but later. Let's let the ball roll. Thank you, Martin.
Let's take the last two from Casper and George. So Casper, do you want to go ahead?
Is there maybe some kind of smell that, if you see it in your code, that might give away that maybe this could be stateless? I guess you're kind of suggesting try it anyway, but what might be a sign that maybe this could be stateless?
Yeah, I don't have many experiences like trying to convert something stateful to stateless. So we had the, I guess, advantage that we are rewriting these from scratch, right? We are not like copy pasting the old code base and kind of trying to extract things. That's not what we do. So we have a new code base and we are creating these UI components from scratch. And so we are just like defaulting to that. Like if it can be just like view function with no interactivity, awesome. If not, let's try config pattern. If it's really hard and if we don't see a way forwards, okay, let's do stateful. So it's just like starting with the easy solution.
Okay, cool. Last question from George, and we'll wrap up.
Okay, so I was just hearing the last episode of from Elm Radio, like today, and I was just remembering that the CTO from vendor told them that actually trying to create stateful components like a lot was the main sort of pain in their application in the beginning. So yeah, I wanted to point out that another argument for the trying to be stateless. Sorry, and another thing is that I've been trying to experiment a bit with just like being smart, using CSS and like what the browser gives you, plus decoders. actually like going deep into using the coders to make stateless components more smart. So just know that you have tools to work with before going from stateless to stateful. You know, like there are things that are still stateless that are pretty good for you to try. And one less, just like I just discovered this today, but there is like this Daisy UI. I don't know if you ever heard of it, but there's like a huge. It's Tailwind based, but there's like a huge set of stateless components there that are just like based on HTML, like smart use of HTML plus CSS. So yeah, it's something to be inspired by. Not really a question, but sorry. Yeah.
Okay, great. I think it's a good time to wrap it up. So please join me once more in thanking Martin for his talk. Thank you, Martin.